What if the most powerful moments in history weren't battles or victories, but the final breaths of the men who held an entire nation together? What if their last moments revealed more about leadership, sacrifice, and faith than any crown or throne ever could? Today, we're stepping into a story shaped by courage, wisdom, and tragedy, a story of four men whose decisions built the foundation of a civilization, and whose deaths changed the course of history forever. Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, Ali ibn Abi Talib, names that stand at the heart of Islam, each carrying a life of honor, and an ending marked by challenges that tested the strength of an entire community. In this documentary, we're not simply exploring how they died. We're uncovering the turning points that shaped their final days, moments where unity, power, and belief collided. Some passed away in peace. Some met their end with wounds that shook the world around them. But all four left legacies that continue to guide millions today. Stay with us as we move through each chapter, not just to witness their final moments, but to understand the weight of the lives they lived leading up to them. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our family has reached. Let's start the journey. Abu Bakr's story begins long before the weight of the Caliphate rested on his shoulders. He grew up in a respected Qurayshi family in Mecca, surrounded by trade routes, tribal politics, and a society shaped by loyalty and honor. Even as a young man, he stood out for his calm judgment and steady character. People trusted him with their disputes, their debts, and even their secrets. His reputation for honesty wasn't something he had to declare. It was something the community had already agreed on. He spent much of his early life working as a merchant. This brought him into contact with different tribes and cultures, teaching him how to read people and negotiate with patience. These experiences would later become essential when he found himself guiding an entire nation through crisis. His business success never hardened him. Instead, it highlighted his generosity. Anyone who came to him with a need knew they wouldn't leave empty-handed. What truly set him apart was the quiet depth of his faith, even before Islam was revealed. He resisted the common practices of idol worship and stayed clear of the moral chaos that surrounded Meccan society. Friends often described him as someone who sought meaning beyond material life, someone who carried a sense of clarity even in an age of uncertainty. Everything changed the moment he heard the message of Islam from the Prophet Muhammad. He didn't ask for proofs or signs. His heart recognized the truth instantly, and he stepped into the faith with unwavering conviction. That early decision shaped the foundation of the Muslim community. He helped protect new converts, supported the Prophet during the most dangerous moments, and offered not just loyalty, but deep friendship that endured through every hardship. As he grew older, every test he faced shaped him into the man who would one day carry the responsibility of leading an entire nation. His early life wasn't marked by drama or spectacle. It was marked by the steady cultivation of integrity, loyalty, and quiet strength. This is the story behind the leader the world would soon rely on. When you understand the roots of his character, the next part of his journey becomes even more powerful. Let's move to the moment when he stepped into leadership and became the first Caliph of Islam. As Abu Bakr's early character becomes clear, the path ahead feels almost inevitable. His loyalty, wisdom, and quiet strength were tested for years, but nothing compared to what waited after the Prophet's passing. This is where the story shifts from preparation to responsibility. The moment news spread that the Prophet had left this world, Medina felt as if its heart had been pulled away. Fear, confusion, and grief rippled through the community. People who had lived through battles and persecution suddenly found themselves unsure of what the next day would look like. In the middle of that chaos, Abu Bakr returned from the outskirts of the city and walked straight into one of the most delicate moments in Islamic history. He entered the Prophet's house with a calm that did not match the storm outside. After saying his final farewell, he stepped out and spoke to the people with clarity that cut through the noise. It wasn't authority that made them listen. It was the trust he had earned over a lifetime. His voice steadied the community when it felt like everything was falling apart. But the question of leadership still hung in the air. Different groups gathered, each afraid that without unity, the entire community could collapse. At that meeting in the hall of Banu Saida, debates grew emotional. Everyone understood what was at stake. They had lost the Prophet. They could not afford to lose their direction. Abu Bakr never pushed himself forward. He reminded the people of their shared mission and the need for stability at a moment when division could have been fatal. His maturity and sincerity softened hearts that were moments away from breaking apart. When he proposed that someone else should lead, many refused. They had seen how he stood by the Prophet in every moment of danger. They had seen how the Prophet trusted him in life and in prayer. And they knew that no one understood the burden of leadership better than he did. When Umar and the others pledged allegiance to him, it marked a turning point. It wasn't simply a political decision. It was an acknowledgement that Abu Bakr's presence could hold the community together when everything seemed ready to fracture. The pressure on him was enormous. Tribes were rebelling, false prophets were rising, and enemies outside Medina were watching closely. Yet he accepted the responsibility not because he wanted it, but because he feared what would happen if he did not. From that moment, the weight of an entire nation rested on his shoulders, and the decisions he made in those early days did more than preserve the community. They defined the direction Islam would take for generations. With his leadership established, the next chapter reveals how his actions shaped a fragile nation into a unified force. His acceptance of the Caliphate set the foundation, but what followed showed why his leadership became a turning point in Islamic history. As soon as he stepped into the role, the calm of his personality met a world full of fire. What he faced next would reveal the true depth of his resolve. Almost immediately, the unity of the Muslim community began to crack. Tribes that had once pledged loyalty started drifting away, some refusing obligations, others turning toward impostors claiming prophethood. It felt as if the progress built over years could collapse in a matter of weeks. Abu Bakr saw this danger clearly. If he allowed fragmentation at the very start, there would be no nation left to defend. His response was firm in a way that surprised even those close to him. He refused to let the early Muslim community dissolve under pressure. His decisions were precise, his strategy unwavering, and his confidence restored strength to people who had been shaken by uncertainty. The wars of apostasy became the defining test of his leadership. He sent commanders across Arabia with a clear mission: protect the unity of the faith. Each victory brought the tribes back into the fold, not through force alone, but through the reassurance that leadership remained stable and decisive. This period didn't just hold the community together. It established the idea that unity wasn't optional, it was essential for survival. As stability returned, Abu Bakr's vision widened. He understood that security came not from walls, but from momentum. Under his direction, the Muslim armies began moving beyond the Arabian Peninsula, confronting powerful empires like Byzantium and Persia. These campaigns weren't reckless leaps. They were strategic steps that opened new chapters in Muslim history. Early victories signaled that a once small, persecuted community was now stepping confidently onto the global stage. Yet his contributions were not limited to military decisions. Abu Bakr recognized that the message of Islam needed protection in a way no one had ever imagined before. After the loss of several Quran reciters in battle, he approved a project that would shape the future of every Muslim household, gathering the Quran in a single written compilation. It was an emotional decision, one he initially hesitated to make, but he knew the risk of losing any part of revelation was too great. His commitment to preserving the Quran became one of the most enduring gifts of his caliphate. Through all these challenges, Abu Bakr governed with a simplicity that kept people close to him. He never treated leadership as a privilege. The same humility that defined his early life remained unchanged, even as his decisions reshaped the destiny of an expanding nation. In a span of only 2 years, he steered the community from its most fragile moment to a place of strength, stability, and purpose. Knowing how much he achieved in such a short time makes the next part of his story even more striking. His successes were remarkable, but his final days carried a quiet weight that still moves hearts today. Let's move to the events that led to the end of his life. His achievements had strengthened the community, But as the momentum of that period carried forward, Abu Bakr himself was quietly approaching the final chapter of his life. The shift from expansion and stability to the stillness of his last days feels sudden, and that contrast makes this part of his story even more compelling. Despite the growing responsibilities around him, he never treated himself as someone separate from the people he served. He lived modestly, worked tirelessly, and often shouldered the emotional strain of leadership alone. Over time, that constant pressure began to show. His health, once steady, started to falter. Those close to him noticed the change before he fully acknowledged it. His voice, still calm and firm in public, carried a quiet fatigue behind closed doors. Around this time, Medina experienced a cold spell that affected many residents. Abu Bakr fell ill during this period, and the sickness lingered longer than anyone expected. What began as something ordinary slowly grew more serious, and each passing day hinted at his decline. Even then, he continued to oversee the affairs of the state, giving instructions, receiving reports, and ensuring that nothing disrupted the unity he had fought so hard to protect. The people around him sensed the gravity of the moment, though he tried to keep the atmosphere light. He was never someone who feared death, but he cared deeply about what would happen after he was gone. His concern wasn't for himself. It was for the community he had guided through its most fragile era. The stability he had built felt strong, yet he knew that leadership during transition mattered just as much as leadership during crisis. As his illness progressed, he became more reflective. He spent more time in prayer and more time advising those closest to him. His conversations carried a tone of careful preparation, as if he wanted to leave no uncertainty behind. He spoke openly about what he believed would serve the community best after his departure, focusing always on its long-term well-being instead of personal ties or preferences. By the time the illness tightened its grip, everyone understood that a significant moment in history was approaching. The man who had stood firm through rebellion, war, and political tension was now facing a test that every leader eventually meets. His final days were shaped by clarity, humility, and a quiet strength that never left him, even as his body weakened. Everything he'd had done until this point, every decision, every struggle, every sacrifice, was leading toward a peaceful but deeply emotional end. And that brings us to the final chapter of his life, when the community he built gathered to witness the passing of its first caliph. As his illness deepened, the atmosphere in Medina shifted into a quiet tension. People moved with a kind of careful awareness, as if any loud step might disturb the fragile balance around their ailing leader. The transition from concern to acceptance happened slowly, and it carried the weight of a community that knew it was approaching the end of an era. Abu Bakr remained composed, even as his strength faded. He had lived his entire life with a sense of responsibility, and his final hours were no different. Surrounded by his family, he spent his last moments in remembrance and calm reflection. There was no fear in him. He understood that his work was complete, and that the community he loved was strong enough to stand without him. When he finally breathed his last, the news moved through Medina like a soft but devastating wave. The grief was real, but so was the deep respect that filled every corner of the city. His funeral reflected the humility that defined his life. There was no extravagance, no attempt to elevate him beyond the simplicity he had always embraced. He was laid to rest beside the Prophet Muhammad, the very place he had always hoped to be, not out of status, but out of love and companionship that had shaped the course of history. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of sorrow and steady resolve. People mourned sincerely, but they also recognized the responsibility he had entrusted to them. His passing marked the end of the first chapter in the leadership of the Muslim nation, yet it did not bring confusion or panic. His careful preparation ensured that the transition to the next caliph unfolded with clarity and unity. Umar's leadership began with that same sense of continuity. The community stepped forward with confidence because Abu Bakr had left no vacuum behind him. He had given them stability, structure, and direction, and that legacy carried them into a new phase of growth. Even long after his burial, his influence remained present in every decision the young nation made. The unity he protected, the the Quran he helped preserve, the strength he restored during the most uncertain days, all of it lived on. His death was quiet, but the impact he left was anything but. It became a reminder that true leadership is not measured by the length of time in power, but by the foundation it leaves behind. And with Abu Bakr's chapter closed, the story now turns toward the next caliph, whose own journey will carry the Muslim community into another defining era. As the story shifts from Abu Bakr's quiet strength to Umar ibn al-Khattab's powerful presence, the tone of the narrative changes with it. Where Abu Bakr's early life moved with subtle influence, Umar's path begins with an intensity that would one day reshape the destiny of an entire nation. Umar was born into a clan that valued toughness, loyalty, and discipline. Life in Mecca demanded resilience, and he grew up in an environment where strength wasn't admired, it was expected. From his earliest years, he learned how to navigate a society built on rivalry and pride. His physical presence alone set him apart. He was tall, strong, and carried himself with a confidence that made people notice him long before he ever raised his voice. But Umar's influence wasn't rooted only in strength. He was one of the few Meccans who could read and write, a skill that added sharpness to his naturally analytical mind. He listened carefully, but he observed even more. Through trade, diplomacy, and the tribal gatherings where important decisions were made, he developed a deep understanding of Meccan politics and human behavior. These early experiences shaped him into someone who could judge a situation with both logic and instinct. His personality was direct and unfiltered. When he believed something was right, he defended it with everything he had. When he thought something was wrong, he confronted it without hesitation. This intensity sometimes made people wary of him, but it also made him impossible to ignore. Beneath the toughness, though, was a sense of fairness that guided his decisions even before Islam revealed its moral framework. Before he embraced the new faith, Umar lived in a Mecca shaped by tradition and ancestral pride. He held onto those customs with conviction, believing they were worth defending. But that same conviction, combined with his clear mind, would one day lead him to question everything he once believed. The shift in him would become one of the most dramatic transformations in early Islamic history, a transformation that speaks to the strength of his character far more than his physical stature ever could. What makes Umar's early life remarkable is not perfection, but the raw potential simmering beneath every decision he made, every argument he engaged in, every journey he took, every responsibility he carried prepared him for a future he never expected. He was being shaped, piece by piece, into someone capable of carrying a burden far heavier than leadership alone. Understanding where he came from gives depth to the moment when his life changes direction forever. And that moment, when the man known for his firmness becomes one of the greatest defenders of the new faith, will open the next chapter of his journey. The story moves from the developing strength of Umar's early life to a moment that would test the limits of that strength. When Abu Bakr's final days approached, the Muslim community sensed another transition on the horizon. The unity they had built was steady, but the world around them was changing fast. New territories were opening, new cultures were entering the fold, and the responsibilities of leadership were expanding by the day. It was in this delicate moment that the question of succession rose once again. Abu Bakr had watched Umar closely throughout the years, not just his power, but his judgment, his integrity, and the way he balanced firmness with sincerity. Despite Umar's reputation for decisive action, those who worked closest with him saw a man who wept in prayer, who feared injustice more than battle, and who carried the burden of responsibility with a seriousness that few could match. Abu Bakr understood that the next leader needed not only strength, but a heart capable of carrying the weight of a growing nation. As his illness worsened, Abu Bakr quietly began speaking to trusted companions, asking them about Umar with one question in mind: would the community remain strong under his leadership? The responses varied. Some feared Umar's intensity, imagining it might be too heavy for people who were still adjusting to rapid changes. But others pointed to the wisdom in his decisions, his deep commitment to fairness, and his ability to correct himself the moment he sensed he had gone too far. In the end, it became clear that his strength was not meant to dominate people. It was meant to protect them. When Abu Bakr finally announced his choice, the news spread quickly. The reaction was a blend of relief, respect, and quiet reflection. Everyone knew Umar's personality, but they also knew his loyalty to justice and his ability to see crises before they formed. When he stood before the community, the weight of the moment settled on him. Leadership was never something he chased, but once placed in his hands, he accepted it with a seriousness that made the gravity of the role unmistakable. His first address as Caliph revealed a side of him many had not seen so openly. He spoke with humility, promising that his strength would always be guided by fairness and that his firmness would never overshadow mercy. The community listened not out of fear, but out of confidence that he understood the difference between authority and responsibility. It was a moment when people realized that the man once known for his boldness had matured into a leader who valued balance above everything else. With the allegiance complete, Umar stepped into a role far more demanding than anything he had faced before. He inherited a nation on the rise, borders stretching outward, and challenges emerging from every direction. And yet, he faced it all with the same clarity that had once governed his early life, the clarity that would soon turn his caliphate into one of the most transformative periods in Islamic history. Now that his leadership has been established, the next chapter reveals how his decisions reshaped lands, systems, and generations in ways that continue to echo even today. As Umar stepped into leadership, the community held its breath. They had chosen a man known for clarity and confidence, someone who didn't bend easily under pressure. But what no one fully expected was how quickly his leadership would reshape the Muslim world. The transition from Abu Bakr's steady guidance to Umar's strategic precision felt like shifting from protection to expansion, from consolidation to transformation. The most striking thing about Umar's caliphate was how he saw possibilities where others saw limits. The borders of the Muslim state were still modest when he took charge, yet he understood that their growing influence demanded a different kind of structure, something organized, sustainable, and just. Under his direction, the state began to develop in ways that no Arabian society had ever imagined before. Cities were no longer just places people lived. They became administrative centers, each with systems designed to ensure fairness and order. Soldiers received regular salaries, markets were monitored for honesty, and public needs became a responsibility of the government, rather than an afterthought. The Muslim world was also entering a new relationship with civilizations it had once known only from a distance. Persia and Byzantium, empires that had dominated regions for centuries, were now facing a force shaped not by wealth or political legacy, but by purpose and discipline. Umar didn't rush into these confrontations blindly. He studied the situation carefully, chose commanders who embodied both skill and integrity, and supported them with a sense of unity that strengthened every campaign. As territories opened one after another, Umar ensured that the people within them were treated with dignity, regardless of their background or beliefs. His approach wasn't driven by conquest alone, it was guided by justice. Inside the heart of the Muslim nation, daily life was changing as well. Umar's sense of responsibility extended to every detail that could affect the well-being of the people. Roads were improved, checkpoints were monitored, and public funds were handled with remarkable transparency. Needy families received support, travelers found safety, and merchants operated in environments where fairness mattered more than status. Umar's leadership brought a level of organization that was new for the region, but it felt natural under his firm, steady hand. His vision wasn't limited to physical expansion or administrative growth. He focused deeply on shaping the moral compass of the society. He encouraged people to live with intention, to understand the weight of their choices, and to value justice as a shared duty, not just a governmental responsibility. Even in private moments, he reminded those around him that leadership, whether over 10 people or 10,000, required accountability before anything else. Umar's caliphate didn't simply add new lands to the map, it created a new standard for what leadership could look like. The systems he built, the fairness he upheld, and the strength he balanced with humility became foundations that future generations would depend on long after he was gone. In just a decade, he transformed a young nation into a structured, respected, and far-reaching state. With this rise to power and expansion complete, the story now turns toward the events that slowly tightened around him. Events that would lead to one of the most emotional endings in early Islamic history. The pace of Umar's caliphate had been fierce. Every year brought new responsibilities, new lands, new systems that needed building. His leadership was not distant or ceremonial. He watched the streets at night to understand how people lived, listened directly to their struggles, and addressed problems before they had the chance to grow. But as the empire expanded and life inside Medina became more structured, a quiet tension began forming in corners easily overlooked. It was the kind of tension that doesn't reveal itself through armies or rebellions, but through individual grievances buried beneath personal histories and complex emotions. Umar's style of leadership was firm, and while it protected the masses, not everyone experienced it the same way. Among the diverse communities that now lived under Muslim rule were people who had lost battles, lost authority, or lost the influence they once held in their own lands. Many accepted the new reality with patience, but a few carried resentment that slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. One of those individuals was Abu Lulu'a, a skilled craftsman living in Medina under the protection of a companion. He was known for his talent, but also for a temperament that shifted quickly. A dispute over his workload and compensation left him feeling wronged, and instead of seeking clarity, his frustration grew into bitterness. Umar's governance was fair, but it did not bend to emotion, and this firmness fed the anger that was already building inside Abu Lulu'a. While Umar remained unaware of the depth of this hidden resentment, he continued his daily duties with the same dedication he had always shown. Each morning, he led the community in prayer, setting aside his personal fatigue to ensure the unity of the people stayed strong. It was in this environment, one of routine, devotion, and unsuspecting calm, that the moment leading to his death began to take shape. As Umar prepared to lead the dawn prayer one morning, the quiet of the mosque wrapped around those who gathered. Nothing seemed unusual. There was no warning, no hint that history was about to shift. But in that stillness, Abu Lulu'a moved through the rows with a concealed weapon, fueled by the resentment he had allowed to take over his judgment. What happened next unfolded in seconds. As Umar stepped forward, fulfilling a role he had carried for years, he was struck with a sudden, violent attack. The force of it shocked the worshippers, breaking the silence of the mosque and sending people scrambling in confusion. Umar collapsed, but even in pain, his instinct was to protect those behind him. He instructed the prayer to continue under another leader, refusing to let chaos interrupt a moment meant for worship. When the attacker fled and the scene finally settled, it became clear that Umar's injuries were severe. The blow he suffered was not something the human body could recover from. Those close to him realized quickly that the Caliph who had guided them through immense expansion and monumental decisions was entering the final phase of his life. The events leading to his death were not part of a grand political plot or a rebellion. They were the tragic result of an individual's private anger colliding with the presence of a leader who had given everything to his people. And as Umar was carried from the mosque, weakened but still composed, the community understood that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most painful moments in their history. Now the story moves to the final chapter of his life, where his strength, humility, and sense of justice remain visible even as his final breaths draw near. The moment Umar was carried out of the mosque, the reality of what had happened began to settle over Medina like a cloud that refused to move. The man who had stood with such confidence, who had brought stability to vast regions and shaped an empire with unmatched discipline, was suddenly fragile in a way no one had ever seen. His wounds were severe, and every physician who examined him understood the truth, even before they put it into words. Umar knew it too. Long before anyone had the courage to say it aloud. Despite the pain, he remained alert, asking for details and making sure the prayer had continued without disruption. His first concern was the safety of the people inside the mosque. His second was whether the attacker had been caught. But when he learned that Abu Lulu'a had taken his own life during the chaos, he expressed neither anger nor relief. His focus shifted instead to what mattered most: the future of the community he had served. As word spread through Medina, people rushed to his side, not out of curiosity, but out of heartbreak. The same man who had walked the streets at night to check if anyone went hungry now lay weakened on his bed, speaking with a voice that carried both strength and acceptance. Families, soldiers, merchants, scholars, every type of person felt the impact of what was happening. It was as though the city itself held its breath. In those final hours, Umar showed the clarity that had defined his leadership from the beginning. He refused to name a successor directly, knowing the weight such a decision carried. Instead, he created a small council of men whose integrity was unquestioned and instructed them to choose the next caliph through consultation. Even in his last moments, he ensured that the process of leadership remained rooted in fairness rather than personal influence. His family surrounded him as his condition continued to decline. He spent his final moments speaking softly, reflecting on the responsibilities he had carried and the mistakes he feared he might have made. His humility in those moments moved everyone around him. He asked to be buried beside the Prophet Muhammad and Abu Bakr, but only if Aisha granted permission. When the message returned confirming her approval, a subtle peace settled over him. Not long after, Umar took his last breath. The news spread through Medina with a weight that silenced conversations and froze people in place. The grief that followed was unlike anything the community had felt since the death of Abu Bakr. For many, it felt as if a pillar holding up the city had suddenly disappeared. Leaders from every corner of the expanding empire mourned him, not just as a caliph, but as a man who had lived with courage, precision, and an unwavering sense of justice. His funeral gathered people from all backgrounds, each one carrying memories of how his decisions had touched their lives. When they lowered him beside the Prophet and Abu Bakr, it marked the end of an era led by men whose character shaped the foundation of Islamic civilization. In the days that followed, the council he appointed began the delicate process of choosing the next leader. Though the grief was heavy, the community did not collapse into confusion or panic. Umar had left behind a system strong enough to withstand the shock of his loss, and he had built a society capable of thinking beyond emotion, guided by principles rather than personalities. His legacy lived on not through monuments or displays of power, but in the fairness of the courts he established, the security of the lands he governed, and the discipline that had become part of the community's character. Long after his burial, people remembered how a man once known for his fierce temperament transformed into a leader whose sense of justice shaped generations. And with Umar's chapter closed, the story now prepares to follow the path of the next caliph, another figure whose journey will open a new phase in the unfolding history of the Muslim world. With Umar's chapter closed, the story now steps into a different atmosphere, one shaped by gentleness, generosity, and quiet strength. The arrival of Uthman ibn Affan introduces a new kind of leadership, one that begins long before he ever sat on the seat of caliph. Uthman was born into the wealthy and influential Umayyad clan of Quraysh, a family known for its status and business connections across Arabia. Yet what made him stand out wasn't power or wealth. It was the remarkable softness of character that followed him wherever he went. In a society where pride often shaped a man's reputation, Uthman's humility made him unforgettable. People noticed the way he listened more than he spoke, how he helped others without expecting anything in return, and how he carried himself with a calm dignity that felt almost unusual for someone of his status. From a young age, he was deeply involved in trade. His travels took him across the Arabian Peninsula, where he built a reputation for fairness in every transaction. Traders trusted him not only because he was honest, but because he treated everyone, regardless of tribe or position, with respect. His business success was steady, yet he never allowed wealth to harden him. Instead, it widened his generosity. Those who knew him often described him as someone whose hands opened before others even asked for help. Uthman's personality carried a spiritual depth long before he became Muslim. He avoided the harshness that defined much of Meccan culture and stayed away from practices he felt contradicted a pure way of life. When he first heard the message of Islam, it touched a part of him that had always searched for something higher than tradition or ancestry. He accepted the faith with a sincerity that felt natural, as though the message simply aligned with the life he was already trying to live. What followed was a transformation that revealed the strength behind his quiet nature. He faced pressure from his own clan, who expected their wealth and power to influence his decisions. Yet Uthman never allowed fear or status to dictate his faith. He stood firm, even when loyalty to Islam cost him comfort and security. His sacrifices deepened his connection to the Prophet Muhammad, who trusted him deeply and valued his loyalty. Their bond grew so strong that Uthman was later honored with marriages to two of the Prophet's daughters, earning him the title Dhun Nurayn, the possessor of two lights. As the Muslim community grew, Uthman's generosity became a cornerstone of its progress. He funded journeys, supported the poor, equipped armies, and stepped forward whenever others hesitated. His kindness wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, consistent, and rooted in genuine compassion. Understanding this foundation is essential because it sets the scene for the contrast that will later define his story. A man known for gentleness and generosity would eventually face some of the most painful challenges in early Islamic history. But before that moment arrives, his journey must move toward the point where the responsibility of leadership finds its way to him, shaping the next chapter of this unfolding story. The gentleness that shaped Uthman's early years now drifts into a new chapter, one where his calm spirit is suddenly placed at the center of one of the most important decisions in the Muslim world. After Umar's tragic departure, the community found itself facing a new kind of uncertainty. They were no longer a small nation held together by survival. They were a vast and growing empire, stretching across lands and cultures that had once seemed unreachable. The next leader needed to carry not only wisdom, but also the kind of temperament that could soothe tensions quietly rising beneath the surface. Umar had anticipated this challenge long before his final moments. Instead of naming a successor directly, he created a council of trusted companions to choose the next caliph. It was a decision that reflected his deep sense of responsibility. He wanted the community to participate in shaping its future, not simply inherit it through one man's preference. The council gathered with the weight of the moment heavy on their shoulders. Each member carried the memory of two towering leaders, Abu Bakr's steady courage and Umar's precise strength. Now they had to choose someone capable of continuing that legacy while guiding the nation through a new phase of expansion and complexity. Discussions unfolded slowly, carefully, with each candidate weighed by both character and capability. When Uthman's name rose to the center, the atmosphere shifted into something almost serene. His reputation for honesty was unquestioned. His generosity had touched nearly every household, and his gentle nature carried the promise of bringing calm after years of intense military and political movement. Even those who admired Umar's firmness understood that the next leader would need a different kind of presence, someone who could soften the sharp edges that naturally appear in a growing empire. But Uthman did not rush toward the honor. Leadership had never been something he sought. The wealth he possessed, the respect he carried, the position he already held within the community, none of it fed his ego. If anything, the idea of becoming caliph humbled him deeply. Those who knew him well could see that he accepted the responsibility not out of desire, but out of a quiet understanding that the nation needed him. When the final vote confirmed him as caliph, the reaction across the community was one of reassurance. People trusted him. They knew his heart leaned toward peace, compassion, and fairness. He stepped forward and addressed the Muslims with words that reflected exactly who he was: soft-spoken, sincere, and deeply conscious of the weight he was taking on. With Uthman's leadership now established, the story begins to move into a phase where his personality, decisions, and generosity will shape a rapidly changing world. It is here, between growth and challenge, between unity and emerging tension, that the next chapter of his caliphate takes form. With Uthman stepping into leadership, the tone of the Muslim world shifted once more. His caliphate began during a period when the empire was not only expanding outward, but also maturing internally. The momentum inherited from earlier caliphs continued, but now it needed a leader who could guide that growth with steadiness instead of force. Uthman's gentle nature, paired with his deep sense of responsibility, proved to be exactly what this new phase required. From the moment he took charge, he focused on strengthening the foundations of a society that had grown far beyond its original borders. The economic landscape was changing rapidly as new lands entered the fold, and Uthman understood that growth without structure could easily lead to inequality. Under his direction, public funds were managed with careful oversight, and wealth from expanding territories was distributed in ways that supported communities instead of letting it concentrate among a few. His generosity influenced these decisions, but it was his sense of fairness that shaped them. The empire's borders continued to push outward during his caliphate, but the nature of these expansions felt more organized than before. Commanders returning from distant regions often spoke about how Uthman's calm leadership gave them the confidence to plan thoroughly and negotiate where possible. New cities emerged, each one adding cultural richness to a community that now stretched across continents. Uthman ensured that these regions had leaders, judges, and administrators who represented not only political authority but also moral integrity. His goal wasn't simply to gain land, it was to create a society that upheld justice no matter how vast it became. One of the most defining contributions of Uthman's caliphate came from something far more lasting than territory or governance. As Islam spread across diverse communities, each with different dialects, accents, and reading styles, concern grew that the recitation of the Quran might begin to vary. Uthman realized the danger this posed to unity. In response, he took on a task that required both courage and incredible trust. Overseeing the production of a standardized written copy of the Quran and sending identical copies to each major region. This wasn't just a political decision. It was a spiritual safeguard that ensured every generation would recite the same words with the same clarity. That single act preserved the integrity of the Quran for the entire Muslim world and continues to shape its recitation today. Inside Medina, Uthman carried his compassion into everyday governance. He worked to improve access to water, expanded the Prophet's mosque, and supported public projects that enhanced life for ordinary families. People often saw him walking through the streets without guards, speaking softly to merchants, and greeting visitors to the city. His leadership wasn't built on authority alone. It was built on the trust he had earned over decades, trust rooted in kindness. Yet as his caliphate grew in influence, the challenges around him grew as well. A new generation was rising, one that had not experienced the early struggles of Islam, and sometimes misunderstood the gentle approach of their leader. Misinterpretations, political friction, and distant grievances began forming under the surface, unnoticed by many. And it was this subtle shift, not foreign armies or external threats, that would eventually cast a shadow over the final years of his rule. With the empire flourishing, yet tension quietly brewing, the next part of Uthman's story leads to one of the most emotional turning points in early Islamic history, a chapter shaped not by conquest, but by the complicated hearts of people within his own nation. As Uthman's caliphate flourished across distant regions, a quieter storm began forming closer to home. It didn't rise from foreign armies or rival empires. It emerged from a growing disconnect between generations, misunderstandings that deepened over time, and the complexities of an expanding society that not everyone knew how to navigate. This shift was subtle at first, almost invisible, but it carried the weight of a tragedy that would soon reshape the course of Islamic history. Uthman's leadership style, rooted in gentleness, had guided the community through years of growth. His compassion, which once brought people together, now collided with a new reality, an empire vast and diverse, filled with voices that didn't always understand or appreciate the softness that defined him. Younger Muslims who had not lived through the early struggles sometimes saw patience as weakness. Others misinterpreted his generosity toward governors as favoritism. Even harmless decisions began to look suspicious through the lens of those who didn't understand his intentions. Meanwhile, distant provinces, rich with new cultures, unfamiliar customs, and rapid changes, became increasingly difficult to manage from Medina. Local tensions, personal rivalries, and political ambitions grew into narratives that twisted the truth. Letters carrying complaints traveled back to the capital, many of them exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Some people believed them without question, not realizing they were becoming instruments in a much larger and increasingly dangerous game. Uthman, in his usual manner, responded with openness. He invited critics to speak directly to him. He replaced governors, reviewed cases, and investigated allegations, hoping transparency would calm the situation. But the more he tried to resolve, the more his humility was taken advantage of by those who sought influence rather than justice. A small but determined group began traveling to Medina, claiming they only wanted clarity, when in reality they had already convinced themselves of a narrative far removed from the truth. As the months passed, their frustrations grew into open defiance. What began as scattered criticism soon hardened into hostility. The atmosphere in Medina changed. Whispers grew louder, and conversations turned tense. People who trusted Uthman were confused by the sudden rise of anger. Those who opposed him became increasingly bold, fueled by misinformation and personal resentment rather than actual cause. The turning point came when a group of agitators, many from outside Medina, arrived under the pretense of gathering answers. Uthman welcomed them kindly, offered explanations, and even allowed them to investigate matters themselves. For a moment, it seemed the tension might dissolve, but as they left the city, a forged letter appeared, reigniting their suspicions and sending them back toward Medina with anger far greater than before. Uthman denied writing the letter, and those who knew him believed him instantly. His honesty had never been questioned, but for the group already driven by resentment, the truth no longer mattered. They surrounded his home, refusing to let him leave, cutting him off from the mosque, the marketplace, and the community he had served for so many years. Inside the house, Uthman remained calm in a way that felt almost otherworldly. He refused to allow anyone to fight for him, insisting that no Muslim blood should be shed on his behalf. He spent his final days reciting the Quran, comforting his family, and praying for the very people who had turned against him. What makes this chapter so heartbreaking is not the scale of the rebellion, but its origin. It wasn't born from the empire's enemies or rival powers. It came from confusion, manipulation, and voices of anger that drowned out truth. The man whose generosity had shaped the early Muslim community now faced betrayal from individuals who never fully understood the heart behind his leadership. And with Uthman confined to his home, surrounded by tension that seemed impossible only years earlier, the story moves toward a moment that remains one of the most painful turning points in Islamic history. The moment when the siege crosses a line from pressure to irreversible tragedy. The anger outside Uthman's home had grown into something heavy and unpredictable. And what began as pressure had now settled into a siege that felt unreal to the people of Medina. The city that once honored him now watched in silence, uncertain of how events had spiraled so far. Inside the house, however, there was no panic. Uthman carried himself with a calm that made the moment feel almost suspended in time, as if he had already accepted what others feared to confront. He had been cut off from the mosque for days. The companions pleaded with him to allow them to defend him, to break the blockade and restore order, but he refused every offer with the same gentle firmness. He insisted that no life should be lost because of him, no sword raised to protect a single man, while the unity of the Muslim community hung in the balance. His decision wasn't born from weakness. It was the same selflessness that had always defined him, protecting others even when he stood alone. As food and water became scarce, neighbors tried to send supplies discreetly, slipping containers through hidden paths or passing them from rooftop to rooftop. Still, the tension at the door grew heavier each day. Those inside could hear the crowd outside shifting restlessly, their frustration sharpened by lies they still believed. Yet Uthman's heart remained peaceful. He spent his time in prayer, reciting verses from the Quran, with a voice steady enough to calm everyone inside, despite the chaos outside. On one of those final mornings, he told the few companions with him that he had seen the Prophet Muhammad in a dream, standing beside Abu Bakr and Umar. They invited him to join them, reassuring him that the hardship he was facing would soon be over. Those words filled the room with a quiet ache. For the first time, the the people closest to him realized just how close the end truly was. The rebels, agitated by their own confusion and pushed by voices among them who craved influence, decided to force their way in. The doors, once guarded by companions, were now undefended by Uthman's command. They burst into the courtyard, driven less by justice and more by the momentum of anger that had been fed for months. Inside, they found Uthman seated with the Quran open before him, reciting as he had done every day of the siege. He didn't rise to confront them. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. Instead, he looked at them with an expression that carried neither fear nor resentment, only sadness for the path they had chosen. His composure unnerved some of them, but it didn't stop those determined to carry out the act they had convinced themselves was necessary. The moment of his death was as tragic as it was symbolic. The page of the Quran before him was stained with his blood, a reminder of the injustice that had taken place inside the home of a man known for generosity, patience, and a heart too soft for the hostility he faced. The shock of what they had done hit even the attackers themselves. The noise outside fell into a silence heavy enough to feel like the entire city was holding its breath. When word spread across Medina, grief poured from every direction. People rushed toward the house, some in disbelief, others in horror, realizing too late the consequences of hesitation and division. The companions wept, not only for their caliph, but for the fracture they feared was now opening within the community. It was a tragedy that no enemy army had caused, one born entirely from confusion, manipulation, and voices that drowned out the truth. Uthman's death became a wound that would shape the next era of Islamic history, dragging the community into a period of tension and conflict, unlike anything it had faced before. And with this chapter closing, the story prepares to enter one of the most challenging phases of the early Muslim world, where leadership, loyalty, and unity will be tested in ways no one imagined. With the story moving from Uthman's gentle spirit toward the life of Ali bin Abi Talib, the atmosphere shifts again, this time into something sharper, deeper, and more intimate. Ali's early years don't begin with wealth or authority. They begin in a household defined by faith, loyalty, and quiet resilience, setting the stage for a leader whose courage would echo through every chapter of Islamic history. Ali was born into the family of Abu Talib, a man who carried the responsibility of supporting the Prophet Muhammad long before Islam was revealed. That environment shaped Ali from the very beginning. His childhood wasn't filled with comfort, but with a blend of simplicity and moral strength that would later define his character. Even as a boy, he carried a calm seriousness that made people pause and look at him twice. There was something thoughtful in the way he observed the world, as if he was always searching for deeper meaning in everything around him. When a famine struck Mecca and Abu Talib struggled to provide for all his children, the Prophet Muhammad took young Ali into his own home. It was a gesture of compassion, but it also placed Ali's life on a path unlike any other. Growing up under the Prophet's care gave him access to a world of wisdom very few could experience. He watched closely how the Prophet moved, spoke, and made decisions, absorbing lessons without being told. That connection, built long before prophethood, became the foundation of a loyalty so unshakable that it shaped every major moment of his life. Ali's acceptance of Islam came at an age when most boys knew little beyond play and curiosity. He embraced the message without hesitation, not because he was told to, but because the truth resonated naturally with him. His faith wasn't youthful impulse, it was clarity. That clarity later fueled acts of bravery that would become legendary, but in his early years it appeared as something quieter, a steady confidence in what was right, even when the world around him resisted change. As he grew older, Ali developed a reputation for both intelligence and courage. He had a unique ability to think deeply yet act decisively. People admired the sharpness of his mind just as much as the strength of his arm. But Ali never carried these qualities with arrogance. His humility was almost disarming, especially for someone gifted with such an unusual combination of insight and bravery. The strongest thread in Ali's early life was the profound bond he shared with the Prophet Muhammad. It was more than family. It was a connection built on trust, shared hardship, and unwavering support. Ali stood with him in every critical moment, from the quiet nights in Mecca to the struggles that unfolded in Medina. That closeness shaped Ali's worldview, teaching him that leadership wasn't about authority, but about carrying the weight of others with patience and integrity. Understanding these roots is essential, because Ali's later life would force him into situations that tested every part of who he was: his intellect, his courage, and his compassion. Each moment of his childhood, each trial he faced, prepared him for a destiny heavier than anything he could have imagined. And with this foundation set, the story now moves toward the moment when the responsibilities of the growing Muslim nation would rest on his shoulders, forcing him to step into leadership during one of the most turbulent periods in Islamic history. Ali's early life placed him close to the heart of Islam, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when leadership would be thrust upon him under circumstances no one wished for. As the shock of Uthman's death settled over Medina, the air felt heavy with grief, anger, and uncertainty. The Muslim world had gone through transitions before, but never one shadowed by such internal turmoil. It was within this fragile atmosphere that the question of who would lead next became impossible to ignore. Ali never sought the position. If anything, he avoided it. Unlike those who fought for influence, Ali carried leadership like a burden rather than a prize. In the days following Uthman's assassination, people began turning to him, not because he asked for their support, but because his presence offered something the community desperately needed: stability wrapped in integrity. His wisdom was known, his courage unquestioned, and his closeness to the Prophet carried a legitimacy no one could challenge. Crowds gathered outside his home, urging him to accept the responsibility. Some arrived out of fear for the future, others out of genuine trust, and others still because they believed only Ali could navigate a situation that threatened to tear the community apart. But Ali hesitated. The city was still raw with anger, and he understood better than anyone that accepting leadership in such a moment meant stepping directly into a storm that had already begun to spin out of control. He warned the people of the challenges ahead. Leadership under peaceful skies was one thing, but leadership in the aftermath of a politically charged tragedy was another. The divisions were real, emotions were unstable, and whoever stepped forward would face trials that could reshape the entire future of the Muslim world. Yet the more he tried to caution them, the more determined they became. Their insistence grew, and their voices rose with urgency. They needed direction. They needed someone whose integrity would not bend under pressure. When Ali finally agreed, it was not out of ambition. It was out of responsibility, a sense that if he stepped aside, the cracks beginning to appear within the community might spread beyond repair. As he walked toward the mosque to accept the pledge, the crowd followed him with a mixture of relief and fear. Everyone understood that this moment wasn't simply about appointing a leader. It was about trying to prevent an emerging crisis from exploding. Ali addressed the people with a tone that matched the gravity of the moment. He spoke honestly, telling them he would rule according to justice alone, without favor or compromise. He made it clear that he would not inherit the politics of previous tensions nor allow personal demands to shape his decisions. His leadership would be guided by principles, not expectations. Some found comfort in those words. Others felt challenged, but no one misunderstood his message. He would lead with truth, even if truth made the path more difficult. With that pledge, the community gave their allegiance. But unlike the smooth transitions of previous caliphs, Ali stepped into his role with the weight of conflict already rising behind him. The unity that had once defined the Muslim nation was now strained, and the smallest shift in direction could spark consequences no one could fully predict. Yet Ali stood firm. His courage had been proven in battle, his wisdom in council, and now both would be tested in leadership. The moment he became caliph marked the beginning of a chapter unlike anything the Muslim community had seen before. A chapter filled with challenges that would push friendships, loyalties, and faith itself to the edge. And with his leadership now established, the story moves toward the complex struggles that would soon define his caliphate. shaping a period remembered for both its hardship and its remarkable resilience. Ali stepped into leadership with a weight no previous caliph had carried. He inherited not a stable empire ready to grow, but a nation struggling to heal from internal wounds. Yet it was within this fragile atmosphere that Ali's strengths became most visible. His caliphate did not unfold in quiet expansion or administrative routine. It unfolded in crisis. And it was in crisis that the depth of his character reshaped the path of Islamic governance. The first challenge he faced was the pressure to act swiftly and emotionally in response to Uthman's tragic death. Many voices around him demanded immediate punishment, each group convinced they held the truth. But Ali refused to let anger guide justice. From the very beginning, he insisted that any legal action must be grounded in evidence, not outrage. It was a difficult stance to take, especially when emotions were inflamed, but it revealed the heart of his leadership, fairness, even when fairness cost him support. With the political climate unstable, Ali redirected his focus to rebuilding the foundations of trust. He believed that leadership meant standing with the people, and he refused to isolate himself behind influence or status. His door remained open, his lifestyle remained simple, and his decisions reflected a commitment to equality that many found refreshing, even if others struggled to adjust to it. Under his guidance, public funds were handled with strict transparency, and those who held authority were reminded that their positions existed to serve, not to rule. One of Ali's most defining contributions emerged from his ability to protect unity while navigating disagreements that threatened to fracture the nation. When unrest rose in regions far from Medina, he worked tirelessly to calm tensions before they ignited into something far worse. He wrote letters to governors and leaders, not with threats, but with reasoning, appealing to their conscience, reminding them of shared values and urging them to place the community above personal ambition. His words, preserved in history, remain some of the most profound teachings on leadership and justice ever recorded. On the battlefield, Ali's presence brought confidence to armies unsettled by conflict. Though he hoped to avoid war, he understood that some situations demanded action to prevent chaos from spreading. In moments where confrontation became unavoidable, he led with discipline and restraint. His aim was never victory for its own sake, but the restoration of stability. Even in the heat of battle, he forbade cruelty and protected those who surrendered. His compassion did not weaken his leadership, it elevated it. Ali's intellectual contributions also shaped the moral framework of the Muslim community. His sermons, judgments, and letters displayed a combination of clarity and spiritual depth that left a lasting imprint on Islamic thought. He addressed issues of governance, justice, humility, and the responsibilities of leadership with a level of insight unmatched in his time. For many, he became the model of what a ruler should be, not only strong, but principled, not only wise, but deeply human. Throughout his caliphate, Ali faced pressures that would have broken leaders with lesser character, yet he remained steady, driven by a belief that truth had to stand firm even when the world pushed against it. His contributions were not measured in new territories or wealth. They were measured in the preservation of values at a time when those values were most vulnerable. And as the challenges around him grew heavier, the story moves toward the events that would draw him into confrontations he never wished for. Events that would shape the final chapter of his life and leave the Muslim world forever changed. The challenges Ali faced as caliph didn't silence him, they sharpened his focus. As the conflict around him intensified, he turned his attention to something far more enduring than battlefield victories or political strategies. He worked to restore the soul of the community, its ethics, its fairness, its spirit of unity, and this became the hallmark of his leadership. Ali believed that leadership meant standing in the center of truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. His decisions reflected a commitment to principles that reached beyond politics. He focused on rebuilding trust between people because he understood that a community fractured in its heart could not stand strong in its future. Every issue brought to him was treated with seriousness, whether it came from a governor, a soldier, or an ordinary citizen. His court became a place where no title could overshadow honesty and no rank could silence fairness. One of the most transformative aspects of his leadership was the way he redefined authority. In a time when emotions ran high, he reminded the nation that power was not a shield for the privileged. He dismissed officials who abused their positions, replacing them with individuals whose integrity could not be questioned. These decisions were not always popular. Some who lost influence resisted him, and others who hoped for personal gain grew frustrated. But Ali refused to bargain with justice. He remained firm, believing that a society built on compromise with corruption would eventually collapse. His sermons and letters reveal a leader who saw beyond the urgency of the moment. He reminded people that strength without morality was a danger, not an asset. He urged them to remember the values that once held the Muslim nation together: humility, mercy, generosity, and a genuine concern for one another. His words carried a depth that touched hearts, even those who disagreed with him politically. They weren't just speeches. They were lessons on how to live with dignity in times of chaos. Ali's leadership also reached into the intellectual and spiritual foundations of the community. The way he explained justice, the manner in which he settled disputes, and the clarity he offered in complex matters became guiding examples for future generations. His insights shaped legal thought and ethical teachings in ways that would echo long after his life ended. Scholars, rulers, and ordinary believers turned to his judgments seeking wisdom, not just rulings. He also placed a powerful emphasis on protecting the vulnerable. Whether dealing with orphans, widows, or travelers far from home, Ali insisted that they not only be helped, but treated with respect. To him, compassion was not occasional, it was a duty that revealed the true health of the society. He personally checked the conditions of the poor, intervened in disputes that others ignored, and reminded leaders across the regions that their strength meant nothing if it wasn't used to uplift those who depended on them. In the midst of political turmoil, Ali held on to the values he had learned from the Prophet, values that guided his choices even when circumstances grew dark. His contributions were not defined by territorial expansion or administrative systems alone. They were defined by the way he tried to preserve the heart of the community while everything around him threatened to pull it apart. And as tension grew and conflicts intensified, his commitment to justice and truth placed him on a collision course with events that would mark the final and most painful chapter of his life. A chapter where his principles would remain unshaken even as danger closed in around him. A struggle that defined Ali's leadership eventually tightened into a moment where the tension of years finally converged. While he continued to guide the community with the same calm resolve that had shaped every part of his life, there was a sense that the turbulence around him was reaching an unavoidable edge. Ali never changed his principles to ease the pressure, and it was that unwavering character that ultimately placed him on a path far more dangerous than any battlefield he had faced before. Despite the conflicts unfolding across the Muslim world, Ali maintained a routine that reflected his grounded nature. Nights found him in prayer, walking through the quiet streets, making sure no family went hungry and no injustice went unnoticed. He lived simply, far removed from the idea of a ruler surrounded by guards and privilege. His openness, however, meant that danger could approach him without warning, and it did. On one of those early mornings in Kufa, as the dawn prayer approached, Ali stepped out of his home with the same steady composure he carried every day. There was nothing unusual about that moment, no sign that history was about to shift. The air was still, the streets silent, the mosque resting in the soft light before sunrise. What Ali did not know was that an assassin had been waiting in those shadows, driven not by justice, but by a twisted conviction that violence could somehow repair the fractures of the time. As Ali entered the mosque, the attacker struck with a lightning quickness meant to end his life instantly. For those nearby, the shock was paralyzing. The man they had relied on for strength, wisdom, and compassion collapsed before them. Yet even in that moment of betrayal, Ali's response reflected the very heart of who he was. He did not lash out in fury or speak words of condemnation. He encouraged calm, urged those around him to continue their prayer, and reminded them not to seek revenge blindly. A wound was severe, and as hours turned into a day, it became clear that this was an injury no physician could heal. His children, companions, and supporters surrounded him, each one carrying a mix of grief and disbelief. The man who had faced armies with unshaken courage now lay on his bed, speaking with a softness that felt heavier than any battle cry. When he finally took his last breath, the room fell into a silence that carried far beyond its walls. The loss was not simply of a leader. It was the departure of someone whose life had shaped the essence of justice for an entire generation. News of his death moved across the region like a shockwave. Kufa fell into mourning, and even those who had disagreed with him felt the weight of what had been lost. With his passing, the Muslim world entered a new and uncertain phase. The unity that Ali had tried so desperately to protect felt fragile again, shaken by the realization that the divisions of the time had claimed one of the most devoted guardians of truth. The aftermath of his death was marked by sorrow, reflection, and a deep sense of consequence. His absence revealed how much he had held together through sheer integrity. Without him, alliances realigned, tensions resurfaced, and the path forward became more complicated than before. Yet his teachings, his judgments, and the sincerity of his character lived on. They shaped scholars, leaders, and ordinary believers for centuries, guiding them through moments when the world felt just as divided as it had in his time. Ali's legacy wasn't built on authority or force. It was built on the way he lived, with courage, humility, and a commitment to justice that remained unbroken even in the face of betrayal. The story of his death is painful, but it also highlights the depth of the man behind the title. And with his chapter closed, the history of the early Muslim world moves into a period shaped heavily by the consequences of his loss, leading into one of the most defining eras the community would ever experience. As the lives of these four great leaders come to a close, their stories leave us with one powerful truth. A nation doesn't rise through power alone, but through the character of the people who guide it. Their final moments weren't just endings. They were lessons. Lessons in courage, lessons in sacrifice, lessons in what it truly means to lead with faith and integrity. If their stories touched you, inspired you, or made you see history in a new light, then stay connected with us. This is just the beginning of a much deeper journey into our shared heritage. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notifications so you never miss the next chapter from Roots of the Ummah. And before you go, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our family has reached. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.